Not just music, not just fame, but echoes etched into hearts, burned into the silence that follows. On the 22nd of July, 2025, the world awoke to a stillness that didn't feel like morning. It felt like the world had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe again. Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, was gone. But if you were listening closely, you knew this wasn't sudden. He'd been saying goodbye all along, in his own way, on his own terms. In his final days, he didn't stage a farewell tour. He didn't cry for sympathy. He simply sat on a throne of pain, looked out into a sea of faces, and gave us everything he had left. And before we begin, let us pause, not in silence, but in reverence, for the voice that refused to go quietly. The 5th of July, 2025. The sky over Birmingham was heavy with gray, but inside Villa Park Stadium, 45,000 people stood beneath the lights, waiting, chanting, hoping. They had come for a celebration. What they got was a farewell dressed as a concert. Ozzy Osbourne, ravaged by Parkinson's disease and recent spinal surgeries, could no longer stand. But that night, he didn't need to. Carried on stage in silence, he was lowered into a custom-made winged leather throne, dark, regal, defiant. It wasn't just a seat, it was a monument. The crowd erupted, not in excitement, but in recognition. This was no longer about a set list or showmanship. This was a man, broken in body, unbreakable in soul, returning to the city where it all began. The concert, titled Back to the Beginning, was never publicly described as his last. But the signs were there. The pacing was slower. The space between songs allowed for breath and memory. And then, when the original Black Sabbath lineup walked onto the stage together, for the first time in 2 decades, time seemed to fold in on itself. Ozzy didn't sing. He bled. Every note trembled at the edge of pain. His voice cracked, swelled, and soared, not because it was strong, but because it was real. He wasn't performing anymore. He was surrendering. There were no fireworks, no lasers, just sound, just truth. Metallica, Tool, Guns N' Roses, and Pantera took turns honoring him, standing on the same stage as fans, not peers. Behind the curtain, Tony Iommi watched quietly, his heart already breaking. Later, he would say, "We think he held on just to do that show." The concert raised over €140 million for Parkinson's research and Birmingham Children's Hospital. But money wasn't the point. The point was presence. Ozzy wasn't wheeled in as a relic. He arrived as a warrior spent, yes, but undefeated. And when the final chords of Paranoid echoed through the stadium, something shifted. People didn't cheer. They stood, still, silent, as if afraid to let the moment pass. Ozzy raised his trembling hand, just once, a small wave, a goodbye, without words. After the show, he was wheeled back into the dressing room, too exhausted to speak. But before being taken home, he rolled into Tony's room, cracked a tired smile, and asked softly, "It went all right, didn't it?" It did. More than all right. That night wasn't a performance. It was a ritual, a reckoning, a final offering from a man who gave everything, his voice, his youth, his body for the music that saved him. And as he disappeared behind the curtain one last time, no one knew what came next. But Ozzy did. In the quiet hours of the 21st of July, 2025, just 16 days after his final performance, Ozzy Osbourne passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was at home in Buckinghamshire, not in a hospital bed, not under fluorescent lights, but surrounded by the people who knew him beyond the stage, his wife Sharon, their children, and the silence of a home that had seen him through decades of storms. There was no announcement at first, no press release, just stillness. The next morning, the world woke into disbelief. News broke like shattered glass. Headlines stumbled. Commentators paused. Radios played Iron Man on loop. Social media, normally loud, turned quiet. Outside his childhood home in Aston, fans gathered with candles and scrawled notes of grief. Some cried, others stood motionless. All of them knew something rare, something once in a generation, had just left us. He was 76 years old, but age never defined him. Energy did. Fire did. Madness did. That voice, haunting, wailing, unforgettable, had been the soundtrack to rebellion, heartache, and healing for over 5 decades. And now, it was gone. Fellow musicians posted tributes within minutes. Elton John, James Hetfield, Dave Grohl, Corey Taylor across genres, generations, and rivalries. Their messages echoed one thing: there will never be another Ozzy. But the most powerful tribute wasn't a quote or a memorial performance. It was the silence. A silence too full to speak. A silence that held decades of thunder, laughter, addiction, resurrection, and love. A silence that stretched from Birmingham to Brazil, Tokyo to Texas. Ozzy didn't leave with fanfare. He slipped away like a final guitar note, one that fades but never truly ends. And in that silence, the world listened, not for sound, but for memory. To the world, it was a powerful concert. To those closest to him, it was a final breath. Tony Iommi had stood beside Ozzy Osbourne through 5 decades of chaos, creativity, collapse, and comeback. But on the morning of the 23rd of July, just 2 days after Ozzy's passing, Tony stepped forward not as a guitarist, not as a rock legend, but as a friend suddenly lost at sea. In an emotional sit-down with ITV News, his voice cracked beneath the weight of memory. "I woke up and it hit me like a ton of bricks," he said. His eyes didn't just hold grief, they carried the ache of something unfinished. Tony revealed something the world hadn't known. Just hours before his death, Ozzy had sent him a text. "I'm really tired," it read. "No energy left." At the time, it sounded like exhaustion. Looking back, it read like a goodbye. In the weeks leading up to the Back to the Beginning concert, Tony had noticed Ozzy's frame, thinner, his movements, slower. Rehearsals were broken up to give him rest. Jokes were told not just to lighten the mood, but to hide the dread. He wasn't rehearsing for a show. He was preparing for the end. And yet, not once did Ozzy complain. Not once did he call it off. Because there was something he needed to do. "He told me he didn't want a big farewell tour," Tony said softly. "No big circus. He just wanted to say thank you to the fans, in the place where it all started." That was Ozzy's final wish. A throne in Birmingham. No fireworks, no encores, just music and goodbye. It wasn't the kind of farewell scripted by managers or marketing teams. It wasn't a campaign. It was something far more human. A tired man's promise to the people who had carried him through addiction, ridicule, surgeries, and second chances. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted truth. And so he gave it song by song, moment by moment, until there was nothing left to give. He knew, Tony admitted, barely audible. He never said the words, but he knew it was the last one. You could feel it in the air. Ozzy's silence backstage wasn't fear. It was peace. He had done what he came to do. The world saw a performance. Tony saw a man breaking into pieces just to give the crowd closure. And that is what made the farewell transcend performance. It became communion. He wasn't just thanking the fans. He was thanking the boys he grew up with in Aston. He was thanking the streets that taught him how to fight. He was thanking the pain that gave him something to scream against. And he was thanking Tony Iommi, the riffmaster, the brother, the quiet anchor in the madness. "We didn't just lose a bandmate," Tony said. "We lost our brother." And for the first time in his career, the man who wrote Thunder could only whisper. Long before the world called them legends, before the dark riffs and shattered arenas, Ozzy and Tony were just 2 kids from Aston, trying to outrun a life they didn't want. They met at Burfield Road School in the early 1962nd. Ozzy-born John Michael Osbourne was the class clown. Loud, mischievous, dyslexic before the word was even understood. But his charm? Unshakable. He could make anyone laugh even on the grayest Birmingham days. Tony Iommi was his opposite. Quiet, reserved, already carrying the weight of 1,000 silent thoughts. He didn't talk much, but when he listened, he heard everything. They weren't best friends right away, but they shared something unspoken. A desperation to escape the factory lines, the smoke-stained skies, the quiet fear that they'd grow old on the same streets without ever being heard. Music became the escape hatch. In evenings after school, They'd pass each other in alleyways or on long walks home. Neither of them could explain it then, but something was forming a bond welded not by similarity, but by need. It wasn't about success. It was about survival. Years later, Tony would recall how Ozzy wasn't the best singer, wasn't even trained, but he had something otherworldly, a presence, a rawness, a scream that didn't ask for permission. And Ozzy? He saw in Tony a kind of genius, a boy who could create thunder from silence. What began as a shared dream in small, dusty rehearsal spaces became Black Sabbath, a sound that redefined what music could feel like. They didn't just play heavy metal, they bled it. But even as success came fame, tours, record deals, their friendship never followed the usual script. They didn't always get along. They fought, drifted apart, reunited, fell apart again. But beneath it all, there was this thread. Something no contract or stage light could touch. When Tony lost the tips of his fingers in a factory accident, Ozzy was there. When Ozzy spiraled into addiction and was kicked out of the band, Tony still watched from afar. And when decades later, they reunited for the 13 album and the End tour, it wasn't for nostalgia. It was to close the circle. Because in all the noise, in all the years, one truth remained. They understood each other when no one else did. Tony wasn't just remembering a vocalist. He was remembering the boy who pulled faces backstage to make him laugh. The boy who wore eyeliner before it was cool. The boy who once whispered, "Do you think we'll make it out of Aston?" They did. But they never left it behind. At Ozzy's memorial, Tony spoke not like a legend, but like a friend. His voice faltered. His hands shook. But his words stayed true. This wasn't just music. This was our life, our blood. And it started with two scared kids who wanted to scream louder than their fear. The world may remember Ozzy Osbourne as a rock god, but Tony Iommi will always remember John Michael Osbourne, the boy from down the street who never stopped being his brother. In the early 1972nd, something loud, dark, and utterly unapologetic roared out of Birmingham, and the world was never the same again. It was called Black Sabbath. But it wasn't just a band, it was a rebellion. At the center of it stood two boys from Aston. Ozzy Osbourne, with a voice that didn't just sing, it wailed, howled, tore through you. And Tony Iommi, whose guitar didn't play notes, it built worlds of thunder and fear and fire. Their 1970 self-titled debut album opened with tolling church bells and distant rumbling thunder, warning listeners this wasn't peace, it was prophecy. No one had ever heard anything like it. Critics didn't know what to do with them, but the fans did. Just months later, Paranoid dropped, and it was seismic. Tracks like Iron Man, War Pigs, and Paranoid weren't just hits. They were anthems for the alienated soundtracks, for those crushed by war, government, poverty, and their own inner demons. Ozzy's voice was raw panic. Tony's riffs were dystopian architecture. Together, they told the truth most people were too scared to face. And they didn't stop. Albums like Master of Reality, Volume 4, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage redefined what music could say. The sound got heavier, the themes got darker. But the message remained. You are not alone in your chaos. Behind the scenes, Tony was crafting riffs with prosthetic fingertips after a workplace accident nearly ended his playing career. He played through pain, literal, constant pain, to invent something new. The sound of survival. Ozzy's lyrics, meanwhile, dug deep into mental illness, addiction, and existential dread, not as gimmicks, but as lived experiences. When he screamed, it wasn't performance, it was confession. They were never polished, never safe, but they were true. By the mid-1972nd, Black Sabbath had become one of the most influential bands in the world. They weren't invited to the table of rock royalty, they burned their own. And still, they didn't chase mainstream approval. They chased feeling. They chased release. While other bands focused on image, Sabbath focused on impact. Their shows were spiritual warfare. Their albums were therapy sessions for the broken, the damned, and the dreamers. They spoke to the kid locked in his room with too many thoughts, to the factory worker who felt invisible, to the misfit who found in their music something fierce enough to match their pain. Even as the band grew, as tours expanded and records sold in the millions, the heart of Sabbath remained unchanged. Ozzy and Tony. that unlikely fusion of chaos and calm, madman and architect, flame and steel. They created something too loud to be ignored, too true to be forgotten. And though the critics rolled their eyes and the awards didn't come easy, it didn't matter. Because in bedrooms and basements around the world, kids heard Sabbath. And for the first time, they heard themselves. From that soot-covered city in England came not just a sound, but a movement, one that lives on today every time a guitar growls or a scream rips through the silence. Black Sabbath didn't just change music. They rebuilt it. And Ozzy's voice, strange, untrained, impossible, became the anthem for every soul who had ever been told they didn't belong. By the late 1972nd, the very force that made Black Sabbath legendary was starting to consume it from the inside. Ozzy Osbourne, the unpredictable lightning bolt at the band's core, was unraveling. Alcohol, cocaine, recklessness, pain he never spoke of. Fame hadn't soothed the wounds of his youth, it had amplified them. In 1979, after missed rehearsals, erratic behavior, and a spiral no one could catch in time, Tony Iommi made the hardest decision of his life. "I let Ozzy go. We were watching him die," Tony would later say, "and we didn't know how to save him," the band continued. They brought in legendary vocalists like Ronnie James Dio and Ian Gillan, and Sabbath remained powerful. But that strange alchemy, the unpredictable, messy, perfect chaos of Tony and Ozzy was broken. And Ozzy? He crashed. Hard. There were arrests, rehab stints, public meltdowns, moments that became headlines and punchlines. But beneath the madness was a man begging to feel alive again. And then, from the wreckage, came something no one expected. A rebirth. With the help of Sharon, who would become his wife and rock, Ozzy launched a solo career that didn't just succeed, it exploded. His first solo album, Blizzard of Oz, gave the world Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley tracks that proved he was far from finished. This wasn't a comeback. It was a reinvention. Ozzy leaned into his madness, his image as the Prince of Darkness. But the pain was never far away. His songs were full of ghosts, of guilt, of survival. He became a cultural force, part rock icon, part walking contradiction. He bit the head off a bat on stage. He sobbed in interviews. He sold millions of records and whispered apologies between the lines of every lyric. And still, something was missing. For decades, fans held out hope. Would Tony and Ozzy ever share a stage again? The silence lasted until 2011. And then, like fate had simply taken its time, they reunited. The connection was instant. No ego. No drama. Just two old friends finding their rhythm again. Laughter, riffs, the quiet understanding of everything they'd survived. In 2013, Black Sabbath released 13, their first album together in 35 years. It hit #1 in the UK and the US. The riffs were slower, the voices aged, but the soul was untouched. Then came the End Tour. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a confession set to music. Each performance felt like closing a wound on stage, before thousands and inside themselves. Tony said it best, "I didn't just get my bandmate back, I got my brother." Their story wasn't just one of music. It was a story of loss and return, of demons faced and grace rediscovered. Ozzy hadn't just survived. He had transcended. And in those final years, as he stood beside Tony once more older, weathered, but burning with everything he hadn't said, the world watched two men who had refused to give up on each other. Their bond had been shattered, rebuilt, forged in chaos, and welded in silence. And in that resurrection, fans didn't just see a band. They saw hope. The 5th of July, 2025. The sky above Villa Park Stadium in Birmingham glowed gold, as if the heavens themselves knew this night would be unlike any other. Ozzy Osbourne, frail, broken by illness, yet still burning with that untamable spirit, rolled onto the stage, not on his feet, but seated in a custom-built winged leather throne. He could no longer stand. Parkinson's disease, multiple spinal surgeries, and decades of battle had taken their toll. But he was here, and that throne? It became more than furniture. It became a monument to endurance. Nearly 45,000 fans filled the stadium. Another 5.8 million watched live from around the world. They came for nostalgia, maybe one last roar of the past. They didn't know they were watching a goodbye. The concert was titled Back to the Beginning, not just a theme but a return to Birmingham, to where it all started, to where Ozzy and Tony had once been, just two schoolboys chasing something brighter than the gray skies above them. That night, the original Black Sabbath lineup reunited for the first time in over 2 decades. No piro, no laser shows, just stripped down, unfiltered truth. The music was raw, imperfect, beautiful. Each note carried decades of pain, love, mistakes, and redemption. Bands like Metallica, Slayer, Guns N' Roses, Tool, and Pantera joined the stage not to steal the spotlight but to bow in tribute. But all eyes stayed on Ozzy. He didn't sing like before. He bled each lyric. His voice cracked. His hand trembled. His eyes shimmered not with stage light, but with farewell. Backstage, those closest to him saw the signs. Tony later said, "We think he held out just to do that show." After the final song, Ozzy didn't bask in the applause. He didn't shout to the crowd or wave grandly. He simply turned to Tony, wheeled into his dressing room, and whispered, "It went all right, didn't it?" That quiet moment, more than any encore, broke the hearts of those who knew. Because they realized this wasn't just a performance. This was a rite. A man who had built a kingdom out of chaos, coming home to end it, not in spectacle, but in stillness. And when Paranoid rang out one last time, it wasn't the song that silenced the world. It was Ozzy's raised hand, trembling but proud, saying goodbye without saying a word. The concert raised 140 million euros for Parkinson's research and Birmingham Children's Hospital. But that wasn't its greatest legacy. Its legacy was human. A man once mocked, once broken, facing death on his own terms. Not as a patient, but as a performer. Not in fear, but in fire. When the lights dimmed, there were no fireworks. Only tears. Only silence. Only the knowledge that something immortal had just taken its final bow. The 21st of July, 2025, 2 weeks after his last performance. Ozzy Osbourne, the voice that once split silence like a scream, died in his sleep, surrounded by Sharon and his children in their Buckinghamshire home. There was no hospital bed, no machines, only a man, a family, and a peace he had never known in life. The world didn't understand the silence at first, but then the headlines began to break. First local, then global. They all carried the same breathless phrase, "Ozzy Osbourne has died." At first, fans didn't believe it, but disbelief quickly turned to grief, and grief into something far larger. Outside his childhood home in Aston, mourners lit candles. Some left guitars with broken strings. Others, handwritten letters addressed simply, "To the Prince of Darkness." All around the globe, stadiums dimmed their lights. Radio stations paused. Streaming platforms lit up with Black Sabbath tributes. And across the internet, from TikTok to Twitter, one message repeated like a heartbeat, "There will never be another Ozzy." But no tribute hit harder than the silence that followed. No music, no movement, just a collective breath held for someone who had given everything and taken nothing with him. Tony Iommi, Ozzy's lifelong brother-in-arms, was the first to speak publicly. In an emotional interview with ITV News, his voice shook. "I woke up, and it hit me like a ton of bricks." He shared a detail no one had known. Ozzy had sent him a final text hours before his death. Just 4 words. "I'm tired, no energy left." Tony had known. Deep down, he had always known. That final concert wasn't just a celebration, it was a farewell in disguise. "He told me weeks ago, all he wanted was one last performance in Birmingham. No farewell tour, no big showbiz send-off, just one night with the fans." For Tony, the grief was not just professional, it was personal, foundational. He didn't just lose a bandmate. He lost the boy who once made him laugh in the schoolyard, the teenager who dared him to dream louder, the man who stood beside him through fame, addiction, recovery, and resurrection. The world had lost a legend. Tony had lost a brother. From Elton John to James Hetfield, from Slipknot to Billie Eilish, Tributes flooded in from every corner of the music world. He wasn't just the godfather of heavy metal, one tribute read. He was the soul of misfits everywhere. But none of it felt enough. Because how do you summarize a life like Ozzy's? He didn't just create music. He bent history around his voice. He gave permission to be broken, brilliant, and loud. He made millions feel seen. In death, Ozzy didn't vanish. He became an echo, one that still hums in every dark lyric, every heavy riff, every outsider who found salvation in sound. And as Tony stood at his memorial, voice breaking, he whispered what the world already knew. This isn't goodbye. This is thank you.